It was June the 9th, 1971, in Rosedale, a coal mining hamlet 65 miles east of Calgary, Alberta, in Canada. It was early in the night, about 10 minutes before 9 p.m, and a bright moon was shining in the nocturnal sky. Even though it was a full moon, Miss Esther Clapperson was surprised by the amount of light which was shining in through a window of her house. Curious as to its cause, she went to the door, accompanied by her dog, George. Once on her porch, the source of the light was revealed to be a rectangular object, which appeared to have either landed or be hovering just off the ground, about 200 feet away at the intersection of two roads. There was no sound she could discern coming from it. Intrigued, Miss Clapperson began to move forwards to get a closer view of the object, but her old dog, apparently sensing danger, physically prevented her from doing so by pushing his body against her. She noticed George was trembling and cowering in fright. He did not bark at all. About the same time, Miss Clapperson noticed that there were 3 figures associated with the craft. 2 of them were inside and could be observed through a large window that ran the length of the vessel. One was making signals to the other being, who was at the front of the object. This entity was apparently trying to get the attention of the 3rd crew member, who was outside, while at the same time using one arm to conceal something that was inside the object. Miss Clapperson thought it might be the control panel which operated the vehicle. Whatever it was, the being kept checking that it was hidden from the witness's gaze. The 3rd being had been engaged in looking for something on the ground. He wasn't digging, but seemed to be picking up stones. He was dressed alike, and looked the same as his companions, in a baggy olive-green jumpsuit. Their faces were concealed by coverings, which looked like pillowcases with keyhole shapes cut out of them to look through. They had narrow wrists, and seemed to be wearing some kind of mitten, with a long pointy thumb piece evident. She did not see their feet, and they seemed to lack elbows and knees. None of them were over 5 feet tall, and they were thin, not showing any muscular development. Having been pushed back, Miss Clapperson returned inside and called her brother. Then she went to the window to see what was happening, only to find the light had been extinguished. Going back outdoors, she was surprised to see that the object and its crew had vanished. Asked in October, some 4 months later, by UFO investigator Bill Allen to estimate the size of the object, Miss Clapperson suggested between 10 and 13 feet. Allen had found grass which had been burned at the site, and which was still blackened all these weeks later. This, when measured, was found to be 20 feet across, suggesting that possibly the craft was larger than first thought. Canadian artist Brian James was so intrigued when he read about the case in the Canadian UFO Reporter that he visited the witness in 1972 and made the sketches of the sighting. Another incident occurred on the 30th of September 1980, but this time in Rosedale, Gippsland, Victoria, Australia. George Blackwell, a 54-year-old man who worked as caretaker on Whiteacres Farm, had retired to bed at about 10:30 p.m. the night before and slept untroubled until 1 a.m. It was then that a whistling screech woke him. The house where he slept was adjacent to the Prince's Highway, so he was used to normal traffic noises. This was different. As he took note of the time on his bedside clock, he heard cows bellowing in the field and the sound of a horse galloping about, as if in a panic. He switched on the light and went to the back door, still in his nightclothes. When he stood outside, he saw an object he estimated to have a diameter of 26 feet and a height of 15 feet. It was flying low over the property, passing between a shed and a cypress hedge, and then between a silo and a tree. It was so low, maybe only 8 to 10 feet above the ground, that part of it was obscured by the shed. The object, which George at first thought was a crashing plane, was domed shape, with a white top and an orange base, lighted with orange and blue lights on the exterior. None of the light seemed to fall on the ground as it passed. The strange craft passed over a haystack and across a paddock, coming to a stop over a 10,000-gallon concrete water tank. After a pause, it landed near the tank. George was perplexed but concerned that the cattle were spooked, as there had been reports of rustling taking place in the area. He decided to dress and go out to the paddock to confront whatever the intruder was. He jumped on a Suzuki motorbike and rode out. He had to stop and open a gate on the way. There he encountered a cow so frightened it was frothing at the mouth. When he opened the gate, the terrified animal ran through and tried to hide against a shed. Continuing, he came to a second gate that led to the paddock, where the object sat, still giving off the weird whistling sound. It was so loud and grating that he stopped about 150 feet away, unable to approach nearer. He sat on the motorbike with the engine still running and its light directed at the craft, holding his hands over his ears for about 3 minutes. He noted that his whole body was trembling like a jelly. Around the bottom section there appeared to be circular windows or lights. Suddenly the noise level increased to an awful scream. Something like a black tube appeared around the base of the UFO, which seemed to inflate to a tremendous size, just beyond the diameter of the object. There was a tremendous bang and a blast of air and heat came from it. This blast almost knocked him off his bike. The UFO rose up and gradually moved off the spot, going eastwards. The black tube deflated into the centre of the base. Around the rim of the base there were 6 evenly spaced V-shaped struts. At a height of about 10 feet, and some 30 feet from where it had rested, the whistling noise ceased, and debris in the form of weeds, rocks, and cowpats fell from the bottom of the craft. George rode to the spot where the craft had been, watching it slowly fade out of sight into the east. In the moonlight he looked down and noticed a burnt ring in the grass, 30 feet across. The excitement over, he returned to the house and found it was now 1:50 a.m. However, his Timex wristwatch had stopped at 1:10 a.m. He removed the watch, which he had owned for about 6 or 7 years, and placed it on a table. It began to work again after 10 minutes, so he put it back on, only for it to stop again. For 3 days the previously reliable watch would not work when worn, then it returned to normal. He laid down but couldn't sleep, his legs feeling shaky after the experience. Finally he rose again about 5 a.m. and examined the paddock in the first light of day. The paddock was covered in yellow flowers, but where the UFO had rested was an 18-inch wide strip, black or brown, consisting of grass flattened in an anti-clockwise direction, 28 feet across. Within that boundary not a single yellow flower remained. 6 areas of undamaged grass matched the struts George had seen on the underside of the object. As he stood examining the landing traces, a truck stopped on the side of the highway, and the driver approached. He informed George that he had seen and been followed by a UFO that morning from Traralgon to Rosedale at 1 a.m, when he pulled over to the side of the road to rest. A woman living nearby also came forward to say she had seen a strange light in the sky that night. At 9 a.m, the owner of the property called in for a routine visit, and was surprised to find his employee as white as a sheet, and learned the story. He informed the local newspaper, the Gippsland Times, and the story was a front-page headline on the 1st of October 1980. Perhaps the strangest aspect of the story was only discovered later that day. The water tank, which was 12 feet high and 8 feet wide, had been full of water on the 29th of September. Now when it was checked, there was only a muddy residue which seemed piled up, as though by suction, at the bottom. An algae which had been floating on top of the water stuck to the sides above the previous waterline. It was estimated that emptying the tank via turning on the spigot would take 72 hours to complete. There was no explanation for how the water had vanished, other than it had been sucked up into the craft. George suffered badly for a week from his close encounter. Every day he experienced severe headaches between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. He could not eat in the morning without being sick, although meals eaten in the evening gave no trouble. His sleep was uneasy for 7 to 8 days. He would awaken in a sweat, until finally he dreamed of encountering the craft, but he was holding a shotgun this time. He awoke with a start, the dream seemingly giving him psychological reassurance of being able to protect himself against the unknown fear. From that time on, his health recovered. None of the cattle seemed to be missing, but many had fled to the far corners of the paddock and needed to be rounded up. None would go near the burnt circle. A Geiger counter was used by UFO investigators some weeks later, but no inexplicable radiation was detected. A year later, at nearby Brigalong, another reservoir was emptied, and a strange burnt mark left on the ground, eerily similar to the Rosedale case. Other lakes and water storage facilities were drained by odd means in Gippsland during the period from 1985 to 1990. George Blackwell eventually tired of being the butt of jokes by people who refused to believe he had seen anything out of the ordinary, and left town sometime later. Bill Chalker, an industrial chemist who has investigated UFOs since the 1970s, and who personally investigated at Rosedale, declared this event one of the best examples of a close encounter of the second kind in Australia. Incredibly, another UFO incident occurred, this time in Rosedale, Queensland, a small town north of Bundaberg. This event took place on the 1st of September 1983. It was reported to a UFO website by one of the witnesses in 1999. Two 15-year-old boys used to go to a nature reserve about a mile behind the house where one of them lived, to smoke in secret. As it was dark, they both took powerful torches with them to light the way. As they sat and talked and smoked their cigarettes, they would shine their torches around the clearing. This night they saw what looked like satellites moving across the Milky Way, which suddenly darted off in multiple directions across the dark sky. With teenage bravado, the two mates said to each other that it would be great if they were UFOs, and they got to meet an alien. Having agreed on this thought, they began shining their torches upward at the lights. As they did so, they noticed the lights did seem to come closer, and the noises of the insects ceased, when suddenly a huge light appeared from their right, just above the top of the trees, filling almost the entire sky. They felt a humming sensation vibrate through their bodies as it passed over the clearing and out of sight. The whole episode had lasted about 10 minutes. That was enough for the boys, who turned and ran home as fast as they could run. Reaching home, they found the family's pet dog jumping the fence and dashing toward the direction they had just come from. They called the dog, which was not the most obedient, to come back, but he ran on heedless. Minutes later they heard the dog yelp as if in pain, and considered going to check on the animal, but were too frightened to go back. As it turned out, the dog returned home the next day, with no visible marks of injury, although it was unusually sluggish for 2 days, before reverting to its old self. Why it yelped remained a mystery. It has been noted by investigators into the paranormal that locations called Fayette often experience weird occurrences. Maybe Rosedales attract the attention of strange visitors too. Or maybe there are just so many incidents in every location which are left unspoken of, shunned and relegated to the dark corners of history.